Welcome back to Archaeology and Futurity. Before providing a general introduction to the rationale and themes behind this conference, I'd like to say a few thank yous. First and foremost, thank you to the Joukowsky Institute for providing the very generous support for making this event possible. In addition to the funding, the Institute and the people that comprise it have provided a welcoming environment to seriously consider the themes of this conference. I can't understate how open everyone has been to the ideas to the ideas that may have seemed initially a bit strange, or maybe they still seem a bit strange. As Ugo so lovingly asked me last night, what the fuck were you thinking when you put this together? But from the outset, Sue Alcock, John Cherry, Peter Van Domelen provided unwavering support, constructive feedback, and tremendous encouragement about the substance, content, and organization of this event. The event itself wouldn't be possible without the tireless efforts of Sarah Sharp and Jess Porter. You generously dealt with my concerns, questions, and requests while making all the necessary arrangements to bring these distinguished speakers together. To be fair, I may have bothered you a bit more than necessary making excuses to come downstairs to play with Jess's dog, Suna. I'd also like to thank Parker Van Valkenburg and Laura McAtackney, who provided support and feedback when I realized I may have no idea what I'm doing when it comes to organizing this kind of event. Thank you also to the graduate students here at the Institute and to the archaeologists in the Department of Anthropology who expressed their interest in this event and put up with my childlike excitement over the last few months. In particular, I'd like to thank Miriam Rothenberg and Alex Marco for volunteering to provide assistance throughout the conference. I'd like to thank Dr. Laurent Olivier for his thought-provoking and poignant keynote last night. His insights have provided us with a fruitful foundation upon which to build our conversations throughout the day. On that note, I would like to thank all of the participants who traveled to be here and contribute to this conference. I'm not exaggerating when I say that I've been able to put together my own personal archaeology dream team to discuss the concept of futurity and its relevance to archaeological thought. I'm greatly looking forward to hearing all of your contributions, and I hold you all in high esteem. Now on to the themes that have brought us together. As a discipline, archaeology has cut its teeth on the study of the past. Seeking, uncovering, collecting, analyzing, interpreting, and curating vestiges or traces of the human past constitute the fundamental aspects of the archaeological endeavor. Framing conversations around the notion of futurity may therefore seem a bit counterintuitive. Keeping in mind Dr. Olivier's insightful keynote and anticipating today's presentations, in these brief opening remarks, I want to suggest that archaeology is indeed a future-oriented discipline. Methodologically, archaeologists are ceaselessly anxious about futures. The truism that archaeology is destructive forces us to confront future absences wrought by our own design. As artifacts are encountered in the field, they're carefully drawn, photographed, plotted, and eventually intimately cared for to ensure their futurity. Sites are protected, manicured, visited, and crowned with designations of heritage to imbue a sense of desired future existence. Museums similarly collapse temporalities, bringing items from non-contemporaneous past into contact with present visitors in anticipation of future material relevance. More fundamentally, archaeology depends on futurity, for an object's persistence through time is what we rely upon for interpreting items of the past in the present. On a more conceptual level, time and temporality are receiving increased scholarly attention, and archaeologists have begun to challenge some of the fundamental aspects of our understanding of time, including chronology, linearity, singularity, and temporal structuration. Archaeologies of the contemporary past, archaeologies of the present, and multi-temporality have pushed the conceptual limits of how historical time has been traditionally structured. If we take futurity seriously, as I suggest we should, the implications create friction with critiques of linearity, progress, and temporal directionality. Futurity demands not necessarily an acceptance, but at least a consideration for that which is yet to be. Time not yet present implies an aspiration or requirement of directional temporal movement toward terrain not yet traversed. It's the very futurity of things that archaeologists depend upon. Their stubbornness bespeaks their longevity and future existence. And engagement with futurity both depends upon and challenges the ontological roots of the succession from past to present to future. The ways in which archaeologists conceptualize the present contemporaneity of objects has been of interest since the 19th century. The challenge, therefore, is in dealing with what German philosopher of history Reinhard Koselleck refers to as the contemporaneity of the non-contemporaneous. For archaeologists, this entails confronting the nowness of material culture from Greek antiquity to the dusty knapsacks left behind by Mexican border crossers. What remains unresolved, however, is how to frame our discussions of the relative nature of contemporaneity, or what some have referred to as consociality. If the historicist approach to the past, rooted in succession and linearity, is insufficient to adequately address the vestiges of the past in our midst, a consideration of futurity may provide a fruitful intervention. But this might entail a shift in how we approach temporality. In responses to critiques of traditional archaeological structuration of time and other treatments of contemporary ruination, some, including people seated here today, have voiced their concerns over an apolitical treatment of how archaeologists produce the archaeological record in time. This ambivalence toward temporal structuration and the place of politics of the present coalesce in a concern for futurity. These are concerns of historical production, of privilege, of memory, of politics, of our discipline, and of course, unknowable futures. They affect the ways in which we interpret the archaeological record, engage with the material world around us, and how we conceive of our roles as archaeologists. In and outside of the academy, archaeologists frequently and anxiously attempt to justify and legitimate the discipline's social relevance in increasingly uncertain times. How do we see the role of archaeology shifting in the near and distant future? What role can or should we play in confronting pressing social issues of the past and present, including but not limited to unimpeded capitalism, environmental instability, political conflict, urban decay and ruination, racism, militarism, heritage management, and displacement crises? Recent literature has sought to reclaim archaeology as a discipline of things from metaphorical and ontological co-option. If we can accept that we have now asserted proprietorship of our discipline, where do we go from here? Today we will hear papers from archaeologists working in geographical contexts around the world that address these very questions in an attempt to discern the relationship between archaeology and futurity. For all sessions throughout the day, each presenter will have 20 minutes, and we ask that all questions and comments are held until all papers have been presented, at which time we will have 30 minutes for discussion. Having a half hour for discussion is our way of encouraging audience questions and comments to facilitate substantive conversation with these distinguished speakers. I'd also like to remind everybody that we do have an active Twitter account going. And the hashtag is JIAAW and hashtag Futurity. I had conversations last night. Please don't make fun of my illiteracy when it comes to social media, but I'm pleased to hear that people are already using these, so thank you. In our first session this morning, our three presenters consider the role of archaeology in moments of disciplinary and political crisis. Our first presenter is Dr. Luann Wurst, who is a professor of anthropology at Michigan Technical University. Dr. Wurst is an historical archaeologist interested in issues of class and labor in rural and industrial contexts in the United States. Her expertise in Marxist theory recently informed a co-edited 2014 special edition in the International Journal of Historical Archaeology entitled Doing History Backward, Toward an Archaeology of the Future, which was one of the sources of inspiration for this conference. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Luann Wurst, who will be giving a paper which asks, should archaeology have a future? Thank you.
Archaeologists have started talking about the future. We are, of course, at a conference on the future of archaeology. An upcoming special issue of Historical Archaeology addresses prospects for SHA's next decades in celebration of their 50th anniversary. And in 2015, Antiquity published a special series on our archaeological futures. All of this is firmly situated within the context that the discipline of archaeology is authentic and legitimate and deserves to have a future. That is, archaeology's very existence is presumed to be natural and self-evident. The boundaries between academic disciplines developed from 1850 to 1945. Wallerstein notes that the existence of these disciplines presumes the naturalness of the process and that the boundaries that have come into existence are self-evident. Patterson lays out the history of this contested development in anthropology and archaeology in the United States. I've previously argued that disciplinary boundaries function ideologically by circumscribing our roles and arenas for action entirely within the boundaries created and assumed to be real. A recent example of this is the 2013 special issue of Archaeological Dialogues that asks, can an archaeologist be a public intellectual? This is a great question, but I was surprised that the discussion focused on archaeologists as intellectuals in public, rather different than my understanding of what a public intellectual implies. In this paper, I want to challenge these ideas and think about whether archaeology should even have a future. Much of what follows entails examining the relationship between capitalism and the academy, neoliberal transformations in higher education, and some of the ways that archaeologists have responded. This is the part that keeps me up at night. I conclude with some suggestions for alternatives working within the dominant capitalist academic structures and those that eschew capitalism itself. And these are the ideas for action that get me out of bed each morning. Terry Eagleton noted that our current economic crisis means that discussions of capitalism are once more on the table. Discussion of capitalism has increased in archaeology as well, but I'm less optimistic that they signal any major transformation. The connections between archaeology and capitalism are well documented for the birth of our discipline, and we've embraced the idea that archaeology is a middle-class practice and device of modernity. Yet I find it interesting that there are few sources that deal with archaeology in the contemporary academy, suggesting that it's easier to confront these realities for our distant past. Those that do consider particular arenas of archaeological labor, such as CRM and development archaeology as disaster capital, or analyses that emphasize the reserve army of archaeologists laboring as part-time instructors. Rather than engage in piecemeal critiques, I want to focus on the larger whole and argue that the academy and the entire structure of education in the United States has always been a part of capitalist social relations. The connection between the academy, the state, and capitalism has been well documented in an enormous body of literature. Education in the United States was not developed and fostered by the state in order to have an educated citizenry, foster democracy, or encourage independent and critical thinking, but rather to create citizen workers to meet the needs of capitalist production. Education is a necessary cost of production, training to reproduce labor in the capitalist class, manufacturing consent to sell one's own labor power, and creating new technologies and economies to increase efficiency, create new markets, and offset the falling rate of profit. Archaeology, like all other parts of the academy, has played its role. Recent transformations in higher education demonstrate not that the academy has only recently become connected to capitalism, but instead that the needs of capital have changed. Neoliberal transformations have meant that the academy is increasingly defined by market relations and has itself become a source for profit, education as just another commodity. This has meant that students are shouldering the costs of their education, justified as a necessary expense for future employment. This is, of course, a big lie. Most students won't see the kinds of returns that make the investment worth it. The logic of the market has been extended to all areas of social life so that education is perceived as a personal capital investment. As Zizek argues, quote, the ultimate triumph of capitalism comes about when each worker becomes his or her own capitalist, the entrepreneur of the self, who decides how much to invest in his or her own future, paying for these investments by becoming indebted, end quote. Withdrawal of state funding for higher education has meant a stronger integration with market forces and the need to generate revenue through increased tuition, external grants, and development money. Tuition costs have skyrocketed, as has the push for online classes, MOOCs, and other ways to generate even more revenue with the same or reduced labor costs. External grant money has become more important than ever. Giraud notes that the endless search for grants means that the university is annexed by defense, corporate, and national security interests. When I was hired at my current institution last year, I was told that it was my responsibility to get grants to pay for our graduate program. Development as a vital source of revenue means that our universities are officially for sale. According to Giraud, quote, many universities seem less interested in higher learning than in becoming licensed storefronts for brand name corporations. We feel the effects of this firsthand in the increased bureaucratic demands of our everyday work life through an emphasis on accountability, benchmarking, assessment, value added, talking about students as consumers, and all those other aspects of the capitalist market. Much of the literature on radical or critical pedagogy does a great job laying out the capitalist structural conditions in higher education. The solutions are typically postulated as taking back our schools to focus on education for democracy. But it's much more complicated than this. These idealistic calls for action are based on the assumption that the education system is not working and needs to be reformed. This is false. The education system does exactly what it's meant to do, support and reproduce capital. Zizek reminds us that even our best intentions are typically turned against us to reinforce the capitalist structures of inequality. Quote, "The more we act freely, the more we are enslaved by the system." We should be especially wary as these neoliberal transformations signal a sea change in the relations of labor, capital, and education. Malad highlights that the, quote, "recent global trends in slashing and burning education budgets are not just the result of greedy, evil neoconservatives, but rather reflect the changing needs of capital." The bottom line is that increased efficiency means that capital does not need as many highly trained workers. The much touted assault on the middle class is simply the reaction to the fact that these workers are becoming superfluous in the new capitalist regimes. This has serious implications for the education system that developed in the post-World War II era to provide these workers. The expansion of the university system played a significant role in the legitimacy and dramatic expansion of archaeology as an academic discipline. If archaeology is a middle-class practice, functioning to train middle-class workers, and these workers are no longer as necessary for global capitalism, we should all think seriously about the ramifications for our discipline. Archaeology has responded to these neoliberal transformations in relatively predictable ways. We have seen the explosion in new programs that take a profit-driven approach to justify their continued existence to university administrators, cloaked in pragmatism and the real-world applicability of training archaeological professionals to work in the CRM industry. St. Cloud University's online MA program in CRM and Binghamton University's MA in Public Archaeology are but two of many examples. The discipline also continues to produce PhDs at an alarming rate, increasing the production of professionals unlikely to find jobs. The number of PhDs in anthropology has increased from 341 annually in 1991 to 555 in 2011. Many of us, myself included, have used the Bureau of Labor Statistics' projected increase in anthropology employment as a recruiting tool to attract new students. The BLS projects a 21% increase in anthropology jobs between 2010 and 2020. This increase, however, cannot absorb all these PhDs. In addition, the projected jobs will be in professional, scientific, and technical services rather than in education, positions that would not even require a PhD in the first place. Indeed, the BLS is projecting shrinkage in jobs associated with research and development in the humanities and social sciences, as well as contraction in jobs with the federal government. This means that the limited employment options available for archaeologists will be in CRM positions that directly serve capital. In light of this, Wolf-Meyer makes a half-hearted suggestion that we need to slow down the number of PhDs being granted, but since this is a politically difficult solution, he argues that programs need to start training graduate students for contract and consulting work. Solutions to this situation are elusive, especially since I suspect many of our colleagues have no desire to change things. The "it is what it is" mentality stemming from the TINA doctrine, there is no alternative to capitalism, makes transformative action difficult. Wall and Perrin discuss the magic trick of critiquing a problem or issue and carrying on regardless. To paraphrase Zizek, we may know very well, but we still do it anyway. And of course it's true that academics, no matter how enlightened we try and be, are often the staunchest gatekeepers. In light of these problems, I've been thinking a lot about the difference between reform and revolutionary action to change both the disciplinary practice and capitalism itself. Reform is based on the idea that inequity in capitalism can be fixed, or at least ameliorated by making it more democratic. Reformist measures are framed in the context of "it is what it is," so we should just try and make it better for as many people as possible. This position ignores the fact that the very logic of capitalism, its inner workings, is fraught with violence and jeopardizes our ability to realize our own humanity. To quote Zizek, the often catastrophic consequences of the smooth functioning of our economic and political systems. Since this violence results from the very logic of capitalism and its laws of motion, attempts to make it more democratic or equitable are doomed to fail. Simply put, the ability of workers to win class struggles in one place or time invariably means the increased exploitation of workers in other places or times. The success of some capitalists to profit is predicated on the failure of others. Thus, at root, efforts to reform capitalism simply perpetuates it. This is why I increasingly worry whether we can ever transform these relations from inside the discipline of archaeology in an academy completely enmeshed in and serving capital. Aber's call to undisciplined anthropology, Starzman's plea for an exit strategy, and Hamelakis' call to pull the emergency brake are especially prescient. Of course, this doesn't mean that we can or do nothing, or should do nothing. Like Starzman, I believe that there are fissures in the structures of the neoliberal academy that allows us to act differently, to refuse to act to support capitalism. I've parsed alternative strategies into those working within the structures of capitalist archaeology and those working against them. An obvious step to reform capitalist archaeology would be to stop producing PhDs. We are culpable for creating our own reserve army of educated, unemployed archaeological workers. Obviously, the solution is fraught with difficulty. Who would get to continue to produce PhDs and who would cease to do so? And how would this fit into the academic archaeological class struggle? These are the political difficulties that Wolf Meyer alludes to. And I often find myself thinking about Bill Roseberry's article, The Unbearable Lightness of Anthropology, in which he argues that elite anthropology departments have always been more able to reproduce themselves than the state institutions resulting from the expansion of the university system in the post-war period. PhD students from elite institutions are more likely to land the venerated tenure-track job than others. But to say that these students are smarter or better is as ideological as saying that all Arabs are terrorists. Roseberry's main point is that this reduces the diversity in the field and closes spaces where politically engaged perspectives have flourished, suggesting that radical change is even less likely. We know, but still do it anyway. Another thing that we can do is stop publishing books. The reality of academic publishing is that companies generate enormous profits from unpaid academic labor. I myself spent a lot of time reviewing prospectuses, writing endorsement, and reviewing books, the peer review coin of the realm. Colleagues think that writing the next book is the most natural and obvious activity, and all these books are seen as evidence for academic fitness, even though author royalties never really amount to anything. Most students can't afford to buy them. Well, I can't either. And many libraries have reduced their expenditures, so these books may not even be available to our students. My institution's library doesn't have many books at all. So instead of thinking about writing books that generate profit for publishing companies, how about we start self-publishing our own? Since we are already engaged in unremunerated peer review, we could still do this to ensure the rigor of the work. Let's accept that our goal in writing books and articles is mainly about the exchange of ideas. We can do this for ourselves and avoid the capitalist structures of the publishing industry. Yes, but I hear you thinking about the criteria needed to achieve the exalted position of tenure, right? Self-published books don't have the cachet of a book published by Oxford or the University of Chicago. But here's the thing. We define the criteria for tenure. I've never worked with a dean who doesn't recognize the different disciplines of different standards for tenure. This is why departments themselves create promotion and tenure documents that are approved by their institutions. If archaeologists truly valued community engagement as much as we say we do, our tenure documents would already reflect this. We know, but still. It should be obvious that these measures require us to question and challenge our own academic privilege. Archaeologists are as embroiled in social Darwinist ideas as any other academics, accepting the implicit idea that those who have succeeded are more fit than those who don't. A serious engagement with the political economy of the academy mitigates these trends. In essence, all of these strategies require us to work in concert instead of competing with each other following capitalist models. We compete with each other for students, grants, publication status, and prestige. But what if we didn't? What if we work collaboratively instead? I think we are sorely in need of collaborative archaeological research geared towards developing a holistic understanding of global capitalism. The need for this is summarized in one of my favorite David Harvey quotes. Quote, "We know a great deal about what divides people, but nowhere near enough about what we have in common." How do we recognize the broader structures of inequality and oppression that produce the very differences that influence our perception? How do we address these structures without falling into the old theoretical trap of a single totalizing explanation? Should we work together, combining our individual research and case studies to emphasize commonalities in the experience of working people, we could inexorably gain a greater understanding of the structures of capitalism itself. We can also start working collaboratively as academics. One easy solution is to stop going to archaeology conferences, to get out of the house, as it were. Disciplinary conferences socialize us in ways that naturalize the discipline itself. Other conferences allow us to question this positioning and see the commonalities we share as scholars rather than as archaeologists. Think about it. Our conferences are so comfortable because there are no surprises. We know what to expect and we act accordingly. Going to other conferences blasts this wide open and creates opportunities to help us realize the broader commonality and how archaeology can contribute to larger social issues, to contribute as public scholars rather than as archaeologists. Eagleton makes a clear distinction between the academic, with narrowly restricted areas of expertise, and the intellectual, who shifts promiscuously across topics. Gramsci contrasts the traditional intellectual, who uncritically perpetuates capitalist structures, with the organic intellectual, whose intellectual activity is critical of the capitalist status quo. Since the structure of the academy and disciplinary boundaries are geared towards perpetuating these structures, perhaps it's time to move beyond the hidden boundaries and start thinking about ourselves as public intellectuals rather than as archaeologists, to bring our craft to bear on political culture as a whole. As archaeologists, we are academics, but to be truly public intellectuals, we need to be more than just archaeologists in public. McGuire argued that archaeology is a weak weapon for political action because it cannot be wielded directly in the struggles over land, life, liberty, and wealth that drive the political process. This is arguably true of any academic discipline, since the disciplinary boundaries themselves thwart this kind of understanding, this kind of praxis. The struggle is to find room for archaeology to participate in creating a different life, one that is not based on the logic of capitalism, one that subverts and transforms inequalities and oppression and strives for social justice and dignity for all humans. This realization opens the door to think about post-archaeological alternatives. Wall and Perrin suggest that we should set up anti-capitalist alternatives to the fare offered by universities. Fortunately, many historical models for what this might look like already exist. One that I've been thinking a lot about is the Work People's College, founded in 1906 and associated with the Finnish Socialist Labor Federation of the International Workers of the World. Hundreds of students trained at the WPC. They were mostly lumber workers and miners until it closed in 1941. The core courses offered include working class history, Marxist economics, and sociology, in addition to the more practical journalism, industrial unionism, and bookkeeping. Their pedagogy rejected memorization since, quote, rote methods of learning would merely result in dogmatism and fail to fully develop the student's ability to think critically. A 1929 textbook produced for the IWW Youth Summer Courses covered topics such as human evolution, early human history, the shift from feudalism to capitalism, the history of the American labor movement, socialist theory, and Marxism. Sounds great, right? What makes this such an interesting anti-capitalist education model is that the idea of the WPC was revived in 2006 when the Twin Cities branch of the IWW decided to provide free, radical, and practical education to the working people of their community. A flyer for one course reads, quote, credit for participation in this class is not transferable to any state or private institution, but only to the daily struggle for the emancipation of the working class. Inspiration for other anti-capitalist education efforts can be gleaned from the Zapatistas, Venezuelan alternatives, and many, many others. In this paper, I have suggested that the entire structure of archaeology as a discipline is implicated in capitalist structures, and that working within our disciplinary boundaries means that our work perpetuates and reproduces those structures. Neoliberal capitalist transformations have positioned archaeology as more marginal than ever before, the academic equivalent of the periphery of the periphery, since reproducing the middle class is less and less necessary to the functioning of contemporary capitalism. Our disciplinary responses to these neoliberal transformations have only served to further enmesh us in those very structures. We know, but still. I would rather work towards a future without archaeology, a future where rather than perpetuating and reproducing the discipline itself, we expend our intellectual energy working through and against the structures of capitalism. I've tried to offer practical ideas of what we can do once we stop hobbling ourselves by our own disciplinary boundaries and ideas of it is what it is. This is a formidable task, but we know.
Thank you very much, Luann. I think the point about conferences is very well taken for those who just returned from Orlando and were just at SAA's in Disney World, no less. One second as we get set up in the system here. Beautiful. All right. Our next presenter is Dr. Laura Makatachny, who is an associate professor in the School of Culture and Society at Aarhus University in Denmark. Dr. Makatachny's work focuses on the politics of memory, materiality, heritage, and representation on the post-conflict landscape of Northern Ireland. She is the author of An Archaeology of the Troubles, The Dark Heritage of Long Kesh Maze Prison, published in 2014 with Oxford University Press. Today she will be giving a paper entitled Archaeological Revelations in the Enduring Post-Colonial, Post-Conflict State. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Makatachny.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invite to talk. Just get some water. There's a lot of kind of really interesting ideas that Matt's brought together in this conference, and I've been trying to engage with them, and I'm hoping I hit the right mark with this, but it's connecting really strongly to the type of work I'm doing at the minute in Ireland, which is going through a big commemorative moment, which I'll talk a little bit about. And particularly, I really enjoyed Laurent's paper yesterday, talking about this idea of how materials have this ability to kind of disrupt futures, even if we don't actually know it now. It always has that latent possibility, and I've kind of seen this with the work I've been doing in prisons in Ireland. So just to give a little bit of an overview, David Lowenthal once remarked that history does not exist in Ireland because the past is still part of the present and therefore is political. I think this is partially true. Some of the past is political and some of it is not as political, and some of it is more meaningful than others. In 2016, we're hitting a kind of first high point of what we call a decade of commemoration, which is really getting slightly overwhelming now, as we had about 3 or 4 years into it, where there's one commemoration after another, linking into class politics with commemorations of major strikes in Dublin from 1913. Then we moved on to the First World War, and now we've hit into the Easter Rising commemorations, which is considered the first kind of major move towards the Republic of Ireland becoming an independent state. In Northern Ireland, we have a different relationship with these type of issues, particularly because of the impact of the Troubles, which happened in between. And I think these kind of make some events more political than others in different places. And I've noticed this in how Belfast and Dublin have commemorated Easter Rising. And we're also in Northern Ireland having the commemoration of the Battle of the Somme in July, which is seen as a kind of blood sacrifice of Ulster soldiers, which created the kind of partition around Northern Ireland. So it's a highly political time, and it's also considered a highly difficult time because of the repercussions of the 50th anniversary in 1966 are seen as one of the kind of founding acts of the Troubles itself. So they're considered very dangerous in a very political time. But I also think it shows there is also at this time a heightened public interest in what we remember of the past and how we incorporate it into the present and direct futures. And so there is that potential for changing old narratives. These connections between the past and the present are part of the national conscious now. Excuse me. And there is a kind of an openness to reassessing particular aspects of the past, which are particularly open to public debate around what's important in the present. And I'd say particularly the role of women has started to become quite a big issue, particularly because we're linking into this kind of pushback against a lot of women's rights, particularly around the issues of abortion and contraception. And that's linking into us wanting to find more women who were involved in 1916 and actually trying to create narratives which are a little more gendered. And I think that material culture is really central to some of these reimaginings. So engaging with the past in Ireland reveals clear disjunctures. There's the interweaving of tradition and innovation that are strongly influenced by the contemporary context and perceived distance of time. And I think this shows differently in different parts of Ireland. For the example of the recent commemorations of the Easter Rising, the more settled and I would say self-satisfied Republic of Ireland feels a distancing of the past. There's an ability to attempt objective reassessment. There is a politics, particularly around this issue of gender, but there is more of a place for multiple narratives. And this ease is seen as in that kind of happy commercialisation of memory and how we remember the Easter Rising, and even a degree of kind of mockery and a kind of playfulness around it. You don't really find this in Northern Ireland. It's much more contained and traditional form of commemoration. It's overtly political, which is bred from long-term disconnects, particularly in nationalist communities, from official narratives, the vacuum left by the lack of official engagement with the recent past at a governmental level, and the importance of claiming ownership and the desire to explicitly conflate the past with the present. And as the great philosopher my mother said, it's because the Easter Rising still matters, and that's why we have a totally different approach to how we commemorate it. Just to show you some examples of the type of posters and types of material evidencing of what's going on. This is in Dublin. I was trying to find my most irrelevant connection to the Easter Rising, and I think the Scrapper Mania, the Rising 2, which is a kind of martial arts kind of contest, possibly won the competition. But I also find it interesting, the discussion of commemoration for me is, particularly in Dublin, is really linked very much to an idea of celebration, and this is overtly seen in this poster for the Wax Museum celebrating the 1916 Easter Rising. There's absolutely no connection to the kind of politics and the darkness of these type of things. In Belfast there's a different type of connections, and they're very much connected to contemporary politics. The connection to the proclamation of the Republic with the rainbow background and cherish all the children of the nation equally links into the fact that we still don't have equal marriage in Northern Ireland despite having it in the Republic of Ireland. And I find it really interesting, this use of these old newspaper headlines from 1918, which was the first election that Sinn Féin became the largest party in Ireland. If you really want an Irish Republic, vote for Sinn Féin, which is actually in Belfast, and we have local elections coming up in the next month. So it's, there's absolutely no subtlety in how they're conflating the past with the present. I also find this rather amusing, that someone decided, I think probably in a fit of drink, to attack a British postbox with green paint rather poorly. And it's interesting how it's represented in the media, because they make it look a little more professional than that. It's not like, you never see the ground splattered with paint around it. So I think it really was probably 10 pints in kind of action. But I do find this interesting on the right-hand side. These posters have appeared all over the place, and a lot of them are trying to actually... there's commemorations of people we've all heard of, the kind of Patrick Pearses and the James Connollys, but there's an increasing attempt to insert women who we haven't heard of. And this is Elizabeth and Eleanor or Nell Core, who were two women who were involved in the Rising and the build-up to the Rising, who ended up losing their jobs afterwards, and they went back to Belfast and, suffered quite strongly from their connections to the kind of nationalist cause. And I study this area and I've never heard of them. So I think it's kind of interesting that there's an attempt by kind of public intellectuals in the area to reinsert women's roles in. So they are trying to use the kind of politics of the context to at least add new narratives and try and rethink not only just how Belfast had its role in the Rising, it's not just a Dublin event, but also trying to put these kind of gendered roles in and trying to move beyond the things we already know. I also find this kind of interesting. I've been spending years walking up and down through West Belfast, taking pictures of murals and seeing how they've evolved over time. This hunger strike mural has been in place at least since 2006, probably a little bit longer than that, and I've been charting its kind of changes over the period. And this turned up just before the Easter Rising commemorations, so it's the first time it's changed from a hunger strike memorial to a kind of Easter Rising one. though it is a little broader with the from bullet to ballot evolution of our revolution. So I think, again, the politics of commemoration in Belfast is so much more about the present than it is about the past. And, you know, it's very noticeable in how different and particularly kind of how solemn a lot of the commemoration is. It's an unresolved political issue. I do find there's some problems though. Like I study women from this period, and I'm very keen that we kind of gender the period much more. I think there's a lot of really important and interesting women, and they really are an indicator of how much the women's movement regressed after the kind of founding of the Republic, which we don't really like talking about. Sorry, I actually moved to the Free State. The Republic didn't actually form until 1949. But there has been, I kind of think, opportunism around how to use commemoration to make money and to, you know, kind of create what Cormac O'Grada would call bad history and bad commemoration. And I've had some discussions with historians about whether if public engage with stuff and it's not really right, does that matter anyway? And I do think it does. Richmond Barracks was a British Army barracks that was used in a number of ways during what is called the revolutionary period from about 1916 to 1924. At one point it processed women who were held during the Easter Rising, probably for no more than a couple of days. And it's being reconfigured now as a place of female memory when actually it really has very little to do with women at all. I think holding women for a day or two is not the main narrative from that site. Actually, a more marginal narrative is probably British soldiers who were held in that site who are really not considered in the national kind of memory. But also it was, you know, used as a Christian Brothers school. It was really a kind of squat for really, really poor Dubliners for quite a long period as well. Like these stories I think are slightly more meaningful than trying to insert gender into a site that nobody else wants, which is pretty much how I read it. So I do think at this period these commemorative events offers the opportunity for wider public discourse on what happened in the past and what it means now. And following on from Lauren's talk yesterday, I think material remains are central to that potential reassessment because they retain this latent ability to provide new meanings that they're not always found at the time, they can be found at different times, and often it's the contemporary context, one of getting funding to do the research to actually go and look for things, but of just having the right moment in time to actually talk about these things. Particularly the 50th commemoration of the Easter Rising was notable for the Irish government wanting to have better relations with the British government and trying to get official status within the EEC. So it was much more open to be having kind of broader ideas, but gender was just not one of them at that time. So now it's really about trying to look for women's roles, which of course I'm really in favour of, but not one of the, we're creating roles that didn't really exist. Defunct prisons, I think, of course, because I work in them, are very important in this context, particularly because they link to issues of political violence. A lot of game-changing events happened in them, and they reveal the vulnerability and negotiated realities of government power, and I think that's also quite important. So we naturalise some of these things that have happened as inevitable when actually they weren't. So the two sites that I know best are Long Kesh Maze Prison in Northern Ireland, which was famously called an icon of the Troubles. Its life as a functional prison closely mirrored the course of the conflict. It was opened as a prison in 1971 and it closed 3 years after the Belfast Agreement in 2001. And a lot of things that happened inside it acted as a catalyst for the Troubles outside, and also it was a reactor. What was happening outside, it had a very close relationship with the conflict. And also, of course, it becomes this troubling remnant then of conflict whenever we supposedly move into a post-conflict state. And I kind of want to look at it against another site, Kilmainham Jail, as kind of a comparative to see how important the materials are of these sites and for the types of stories we can tell from them. Long Kesh Maze is a huge site. It contains an archaeological survey of it, showed that it contained over 300 buildings, none of which had been completely torn down because it has such a lot of land that every time they needed a new building, they just moved on. They didn't knock anything down. So you had a whole site progression. You had 2 different forms of prison. Of course, there's connection to hunger strikes and to, to actually a lot of stories that we don't even really know very much about, like the prison officer stories, particularly the number of prison officers who were sent over from Scotland and England who had to live on the site. So there's a lot of different things that come out of this, but the potential to tell those stories is retained in this site, which whenever you get rid of the site kind of loses that ability. The material remains of the site when it closed were immense. There was just actually overwhelmingly far too much stuff. I was kind of almost happy when I couldn't get access to the site because it would just become a kind of recording exercise for all the stuff. And it really did look kind of like a Marie Celeste. Like whenever you walked around, literally just looked like it had been abandoned. There's people's coffee cups and sweet wrappers still sitting where they'd been before they'd left. For the last day, whenever they were working in September 2001. So it just was really sitting there waiting for a really in-depth archaeological investigation, which has never happened. Kilmainham Jail, on the other hand, is a 18th century prison. It was built in 1796. It was closed for the last time in 1924. And it's equally iconic due to its connection with political prisoners from the United Irishman Rebellion of 1798 onwards. And it also connects to other social narratives in Ireland, particularly the famine and transportation of prisoners to Australia. So it is a really important site now. It's one of the top 5 prey-in sites in Ireland, and it's one of those places that a lot of tourists go to get their kind of dose of political Irish history. Again, it's an interesting site for an archaeologist because, as you can see from the 2 wings, have 2 different styles which date from different ideas of what prisons were for and how they were used. So it's kind of an interesting space to look at how prisoners were housed and how they were able to counteract it or not. The project I did there was looking at graffiti, which is only left in 1 wing, which is the west wing. The reason it is left because that wing was considered so old and decrepit that they kept planning to knock it down, even it was being reopened as a heritage site, so it left this remnants behind. So I took a project of spending pretty much 9 months going around every tiny scrap of that building, recording lots and lots of graffiti, and took around 10,000 photographs. Trying to look, actually the aim of it was to look for stories of women, particularly related to the Civil War, which was the last period of imprisonment before the site closed. And actually I found women's stories, but I also found a lot of other stories I wasn't expecting. What I did find was that the women who were held there in 1922 to 23 really didn't, meekly serve their time. They created a lot of graffiti, and a lot of it was quite derogatory to the people who were holding them, who were now the people who they'd fought against the British with the year before were now imprisoning them for their roles in doing that. We were able to find a lot of women who we didn't know. In 1985, the first major book about women of the period guesstimated around 300 women had been held during that period. We found from graffiti and autograph books around 650 were definitely held. We know there's discrepancies, so there could have been even more. So we find names and addresses on walls, which is really helpful. But I kind of love some of these things they write as well. Like, may the harp of old Ireland never want for a string while there's a gut in the Free State Army. And these are written in the middle of corridors in the prisons, so they're absolutely not afraid of the people who are imprisoning them. And this idea that prisons are about control, they're negotiated, and the power relations are obviously very negotiated. But the women did suffer for being held in these, particularly the kind of taint of middle class and upper class women, which many of them were, being held in prisons by soldiers and men of ill repute, did impact on a lot of their reputations and their lives afterwards. And then I found a lot of soldiers, a lot of British soldiers. So many of them I found, whenever we started to look them up, were actually of Irish background. So, and whenever I tell people this in Dublin, they go, "Oh yeah, they're probably from Belfast." I'm like, no, actually, they're mainly from Dublin, Dundalk, Cork. This idea that people couldn't be an Irish nationalist and a British soldier at the same time is an idea of post-partition. It's not an idea that was current at the time. And then lastly, if we want to look at stories that people really don't want to talk about, is the issue of sexual violence against women during this period, this kind of idea that it didn't happen, mainly because women didn't go to the police, funnily enough, and didn't really talk about it. But I find it interesting. One of the things that actually kind of made me feel a bit ill when I found it was this piece of graffiti that soldiers had created where they were all standing around drawing pictures near a window. And I just noticed how the pubic area had been scarred out of the woman. And it just kind of made me think about, this kind of sinister edge to these kind of images. What is this saying about men's relationships with women at the time whenever they're drawing pictures like this and gouging out their kind of pubic areas? And I was asked, so maybe it was just someone trying to cover it. Whenever they try and cover graffiti, they paint over it or they draw over it. They don't gouge out the pubic area. So I kind of, really wanted to think more about what women's roles were, what their experiences really were, and just because they didn't talk about sexual assault doesn't mean it didn't happen, because there is more than enough hints in the records when I began to look at it to show that it did happen. So just to link very quickly into the future, which I'm supposed to be talking about. So these troubling remnants of past conflict, I think, retain a potential to unsettle, but also to allow new narratives of the past to emerge. And this is particularly important when public memory is open for negotiation, particularly around commemorative periods. By retaining material culture such as Kilmainham Jail and structures, even simply by preventing their complete destruction, as Laurent said yesterday, they retain the potential for reinterpretation, which is why I think they're uncomfortable, unruly and important, even when they're not important, even when they're kind of derelict and nobody's looking at them. They retain that potential to be important. And I think possibly we have to push this potential forward through engagement with other more creative disciplines, including performance art. And here's my final little project. I get to do all these really interesting things because people are interested in women and graffiti at the minute. So I was contacted by a group of performance artists who were doing this project, which they call Futures Histories, which is going to take place in Kilmainham Jail on the 21st of May. I'm still not entirely sure what I'm going to do or why I agreed to do it, but what we want to do is to try and reconfigure space and try and create new meanings in space, which actually reflect real old meanings. One of the things I found when I was doing my studies is the women who were held during the Civil War in this, in the Kilmainham Jail, which was 7 years after the Easter Rising, held the official anti-treaty Republican commemoration of the Easter Rising in the jail, and many of them wrote up these, nice little kind of lists of what they did and where they did it. And one of the things I noticed is that the women were commemorating the men, and they were barely commemorating themselves. And their roles, they kind of, were involved in writing out of, as well as the men writing them out and the media writing them out. They actually wrote themselves out of it. So what we want to do is use one of the cells in the basement, which was a punishment cell, to have a performance, and we're going to bring people in small numbers in the dark, and we're going to recite only the bits connected to females in this commemoration. So we want to have a partial commemoration of a partial commemoration. And the other thing is that the person I'm working with, who's a performance artist, is from Dublin, I'm from Belfast, so the issues of us having different accents is actually important to try and put this northern perspective back in, which again is completely written out of the memories of the period because of this discomfiture about partition happening only 5 or 6 years afterwards. So I really like this idea of trying to create this unsettling environment and actually use creative arts to kind of make people question what it's like to be in prison. It's not a Disney prison, it's not somewhere that's nice and where you go with your family for a nice day out. It should be unsettling, it should be dark, and people should have to really think about what went on in there and the role of gender, the role of memory, and the role of different narratives that we don't really want to talk about. This was Kilmainham Jail in the 1950s before they decided to reconstruct it as a heritage site. It had been left derelict for nearly 30 years at this stage. And it's a crumbling mess against the picture I showed you earlier. But I argue that just the structure standing retained that possibility of being able to find those narratives through graffiti. This is Long Kishme's, which there's not very much left of, which now doesn't really retain a lot of possibilities for the structures at least. One of the things I found interesting when the government decided they didn't want to keep the site, it was too troubling and they would only retain like the couple of representative buildings, even though they don't need the site for anything else. People started taking bits of the site with them, so it's kind of being recontextualized in community museums. So there's still that potential for these things to tell us different stories, but that we kind of lose some of that when structures like this disappear. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Our final presenter for this morning's session is Dr. Dimitris Papadopoulos. Dr. Papadopoulos is an adjunct assistant professor of anthropology at Lehman College, part of the CUNY system, and a postdoctoral research associate at the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life at Columbia University. His work combines landscape, materiality, digital, anthropological, architectural, and archaeological approaches in analyses of memory and representation at sites of heritage in Greek border zones. Today he will be presenting a paper entitled Suspended Landscapes, Crisis, Urgency, and Materiality at the Margins of Europe. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Papadopoulos.
Thank you, Matt, for the invitation. It's great to be here. So what I'm going to talk about is the challenges, the possibilities or impossibilities for an archaeology of crisis, urgency, and emergency. I will use different perspectives in terms of disciplinary angles to that and different scales perhaps, but some of which are not necessarily within the archaeological domain, however we want to define it. But I believe that the problematic here is not limited to merely metaphorical use of archaeology, because I believe we already have plenty of metaphorical uses of archaeology. It rather originates from the field, on the ground, through things and spaces, and from the following question: how do we trace and capture the often elusive and less visible materialities of crisis and emergency? How can we flesh out material histories of ongoing economic degradation, forced migration, humanitarian disasters? So the question comes from a very real, felt crisis happening right now in Europe. So the European so-called refugee crisis and the state of emergency on Europe's southeast borders overlaps with a still ongoing Greek financial crisis and the austerity policies that have a devastating impact in urban space, as most explicitly reflected in the case of Athens. Now, this double crisis, a symptom perhaps of a deeper, more systemic European crisis, currently shapes and transforms borders, cities, and landscapes in ways that may indicate a rupture with the past, but also decisively frame any sense of the future. This transformation is a major transformation. It's a still unfolding project of spatial and material production and destruction, a process of slow violence that is very real and felt on the ground, yet far from complete. So the question is, how can we talk? How can we analyze? How can we visualize this transformation? I will highlight. Oh, wrong. I will highlight three aspects here. The first thing is the conceptual power of crisis as a framing device. Okay, everything is seen through the crisis. Number two, its capacity to generate spatio-temporal tensions. And third factor, the material dimension of the crisis, its ruin-making power. I will try to match that with a brief note on a different historic moment in Greek history, that of the Greek Civil War and the materialities that it has produced and that they have worked on. So my presentation is going to be a little bit fragmented because it comes from different places and times of fieldwork. Sort of both archaeological field observations, but mostly ethnographic fieldwork. And if you can see the sites here. This is Athens. This is the borders that are shared between Greece, Albania, and Macedonia. That was one of the major fields I worked on. And this is Lesbos, an Aegean island that has been at the foreground of the refugee crisis right now. And I think this point is a good opportunity to mention that as we speak, there is an archaeological conference on Lesbos called Archaeological Dialogues, and I should stress that there is a specific session about the archaeologists of the contemporary world, and that is specifically important in the Greek context, and that's good news. So now I think most of you are quite familiar with the statistics and figures of the Greek financial crisis going on for over 6 years now. Here's some statistics about the refugee crisis. Greek Aegean islands, Lesbos, Chios, Kos, Samos have been the first landing points for hundreds of thousands of refugees aiming to reach Central Europe through the so-called Balkan routes. According to the UN Refugee Agency, there have been over 1 million of sea arrivals in the Greek islands in 2015 and over 170,000 in 2016 so far. So that data is almost it's already outdated. There have been 3,773 deaths or missing people, and 716 already in 2016, including a great number of children. But beyond the statistics, we need to acknowledge some basic shortcomings of analysis and scholarly work when it comes to the Greek crisis or the European crisis. First, despite the increased production of scholarship in the last years, there is a failure to capture, analyze, and most importantly, respond to the crisis in a timely, relevant, and socially engaging way. Analytical frameworks, methodological tools have failed to fully map ground realities, follow the pace and density of historic events, and more evidently forecast any possible future trajectories. Second, we need to acknowledge that the crisis is now a buzzword. It's a self-evident condition justifying scholarly work and interest. But we need to interrogate the very concept of crisis as an analytical device and critical think about its implications. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of the crisis has to do with the spatio-temporal tensions it creates. The refugee crisis, and especially the aggressive anti-immigrant response by European states, directly undermines the vision of a borderless Europe and triggers conflict, division, and tension along over secularized and militarized borders. At the same time, the Greek financial crisis, as perceived and experienced especially in major urban centers like Athens, has unleashed multi-temporal narratives, retrieved past memories of both decline and glory, and has reactivated recent or more distant layers of the urban landscape. What is perceived as historical significant times has fueled protests, but has also opened up possibilities for imagining alternative futures through social movements. Historical moments and periods as recent as a military junta or the Greek Civil War, or as distant as the Hellenistic times, are being instrumentalized and embedded into political discourse and action. Yanis Hamblakis has recently talked about the archaeopolitics of the discovery of the ancient Macedonian tomb at Amphipolis in northern Greece. A major archaeological event that was a big deal recently in Greece. And other scholars have also highlighted and discussed the multiplicity of narratives, challenging linear views of time as a condition, as a basic condition of the Greek crisis. This temporal disturbance, this turbulence of layers and memories, or what Dimitris Papanikolaou has called archive trouble, is a phenomenon of a crisis that is manifest in different formats and platforms, from art projects and cultural production to performative modes of protest. Now, this is on the left and on the bottom, this is a makeshift memorial for a 16-year-old who was shot by a police officer in Athens. And that was before the crisis actually started. The crisis started in 2010, but has been associated with this memory and the politics of the crisis. And actually, you can see this makeshift memorial has some really material practices into it. People will leave objects there and go visit, and they even changed the street sign to the name of the 16-year-old who was killed. The crisis, however, and perhaps most importantly, is a way also of reshaping, destructing, materially transforming the city. One would ask, where are the ruins of crisis? Now, when we think of Greek ruins, we tend to think of certain things. And I mean, on the right you can see the obvious metaphor. Broken marble, broken future. The Parthenon, right? The image on the left is a little bit trickier because there's a sign, come see our ruins, but there are not ruins to see. There's an absence of ruins, which I find interesting. And although this political cartoon implies the absence of classical ruins, I think this idea of absent ruins is interesting. In a sense that while the obvious absence of ruins is that of the Greek classical ones, the reference also could be read as an absence and invisibility of the ruins produced by the current sociopolitical crisis and the institutions that have produced it. This absence of contemporary ruins is telling, and it has to be addressed. The invisibility of the crisis as a ruin-making force, as a ruination process, and we need to think here of Anne Stoller's definition of a ruin as both a claim about the state of a thing and a process affecting it. This absence has been recently addressed by anthropologist Neni Panouria, proposing and highlighting the need for a cartography of visuality of the crisis. What does it really look like on the ground? Not just the structural changes and damages that it has incurred, but actual descriptions of its appearance. A radical genealogy of the crisis, maybe even an archaeology of it. The Greek financial crisis has transformed to a great extent and still shaping Athens in visible ways from abandoned storefronts and neighborhoods of the new poor to dismantled public health services or ruined infrastructure. It has also fueled racist, xenophobic violence in city streets and neighborhoods, as most notoriously demonstrated by Golden Dawn, the neo-Nazi organization currently on trial for hate crimes. At the same time, new urban movements and networks of protest and solidarity have also emerged. Although the Greek crisis has been associated through global media through images of street riots and violent confrontations with the police, both social movements and individual performative acts of protest have also marked the urban landscape. Self-managed public spaces, building squats, graffiti and wall murals, art installations and performances, or makeshift memorials like the one we saw, are spatial and material practices of claiming the urban landscape through an inventive repertoire of tools and objects, from spray paint to street signs and from candles to concrete or reused building materials. Now, this materiality of the crisis has a dual nature. It can be seen both as a still incomplete layer of destruction, of slow violence, or as a set of ruins in the making, but also as a trace of what the very experience of the crisis and the response to it, or the resistance to it, produces. In other words, these things and places do not just constitute the material record of the devastating impact of the crisis, they also constitute the material memory, to use Laurent Olivier's term, still in the making, of the ways in which citizens and social groups are trying to cope with it, through things and spaces, through resistive spatial and material practices. Now, I think that the materiality of the double crisis is even more evident in the case of the refugee situation in Greece. This is an image from the Idomeni camp at the Greek-Macedonian border. This is not an organized camp with proper infrastructure. This is a makeshift refugee camp. And we're seeing that the refugee crisis in Greece is producing new spatial entities and materialities. We have reinforced borders, we have border checkpoints and patrols, we have surveillance and support infrastructure, we have exceptional sites such as refugee camps, detention centers, both at the border and in major urban centers, including Athens. These are some of the sites I will refer to on Lesbos in the Aegean. And this is the main refugee camp, the organized camp on the islands called Moria. I think it's important to understand that for some of these spaces and objects, documentation is an urgent or time-sensitive task. The Idomeni camp that we just saw, for example, is a makeshift camp, as I said, with no proper infrastructure that will be eventually evacuated. This again is from the Moria camp on Lesbos. Rubber boats, the dinghies that the refugees use to cross the sea, and life jackets are collected, reused, recycled, abandoned. They're creating a new layer on the island, and they also have different uses. As you can see on the top left, this is what the Lesbos shorelines look like. These are all life jackets left there. And on the bottom right, it's when they're actually being used on the boat. What you see on the top right and bottom left is an art installation project by Chinese artist Ai Weiwei. And he's used original life jackets from Lesbos as part of an installation at the Berlin Concert Hall. So it's a transformation of this object into performative practice. Again, another part of the material culture of the refugee crisis, the thermal blankets the refugees use when they're finally land. And down there you can see there are also some other kinds of uses for thermal blankets. Now, I would like to single out a certain site on Lesbos because I think it best reflects multiple aspects and levels of what we call crisis materiality. So this is at the outskirts of the port town of Lesbos, Mytilene, and this is a cemetery called Agios Panteleimon. Now, Agios Panteleimon is the final destination of the poor, of the subaltern, of the invisible inhabitants of Lesbos, of minorities, including Jehovah's Witnesses, and lately of refugees. This cemetery is filled to capacity. According to local authorities and to the morgue personnel, there are currently only 7 places left. And that was back in the summer 2015 when I was doing the research. And this part of the cemetery is where the refugees are buried, and it kind of resembles mass graves. You have misspelled makeshift burial signs made out of a piece of wood or marble with only the first name scribbled in Greek or Arabic, or just the date of death, not even a name, having unknown on the stone. Now, the inability to properly grieve the other, the unpreparedness for the presence of the other, seems to be in conflict with the island's recent past, including a historic refugee flow from Asia Minor of Greeks during the Greek-Turkish population exchange of 1922-1923. What is interesting, though, is, and I'll only briefly mention that, they have been some interesting events in Lesbos. On the top right, you have a common prayer of Greek Orthodox priests with some of the Muslim refugees for the deaths in the Aegean. On the left, you have a sort of a makeshift praying space at the Idomeni camp. It's one of the camps in northern Greece. Now, I think I don't have much more time, so I will very briefly note some analogies with the materialities of the Greek Civil War. So this is a region in northwest Greece, in Prespa Lakes, and these are deserted houses and deserted villages following the Greek Civil War. The region was devastated by the war. And there are certain traces and objects that are still observable. So these are objects found in one of the caves that was used as a hospital to treat the wounded during the war by the guerrilla fighters. So the date of these objects is roughly 1949. So I will skip the part to conclude. So the question is, how can we imagine an archaeology of urgency, of crisis? How can we work with the things and the spaces that crisis produces? To quote once again Neni Panouria, this is a research endeavor that treads on dangerous and unsafe grounds, as its object, the crisis, has an embodied materiality which is witnessed on the bodies of the citizens while it's being wished away as soon as possible. What knowledges become possible under circumstances of crisis, especially crisis that is itself the object of objections and suspicion as to what exactly comprises it and what exactly it constitutes? I will only briefly sketch a few ideas in trying to imagine possible directions here. First, it seems that in order to succeed in the time-sensitive task of documenting change, distraction, displacement, we need to enter the field with what Michael Shanks has called forensic suspicion, that within a crime scene, everything can be evidence. Second, it looks like this could be a borderline archaeology, not just in geographic terms, but also in terms of methodological and disciplinary boundaries, working on mass mobility and major transformation in urban environments, for example. We have a lot to draw from different fields and tools, including, for example, media archaeology. And at this point, I would like to mention Shannon Mattern, who has called, partly inspired by the work of archaeologists like Chris Whitmore, for not just a metaphorical but actual archaeology of urban media, networks, and infrastructures, showing a possible ground for exploration between media archaeology and archaeology proper. Technologies of mapping, remote sensing, and data visualization could also open up new possibilities if matched with the richness of fieldwork. Now, the problematic of an archaeological research response to the crisis has also been highlighted by other scholars, and I would like to quickly mention here Kostis Kourelis, who in a recent blog post explored the possibility of an archaeology of care, as first discussed by Richard Rothaus. I find the idea of an archaeology of care and attention to things and bodies in relation to a materially present but silent other. I find that this idea encapsulates both the need to respond to urgencies in solidarity with those suffering, as well as a deep commitment to things and spaces themselves. Finally, I believe that an archaeology of the crisis would almost inevitably have to be an archaeology that is itself in crisis, returning here to the ancient Greek etymology of the world, crisis, but also critique, being critical. An archaeology, in other words, that could shake and challenge its own temporal and disciplinary boundaries. A socially engaging and critical archaeology could be a first response to crisis, perhaps a critical archaeology of care. And I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all three of our initial speakers. You really started us off on a great note, thinking about archaeological approaches to crises across the globe, geopolitical and others, of course, and as well as disciplinary crises that we may be going through ourselves as we conduct archaeological work. So we have about 15 minutes for questions and comments. If you have anything directed toward particular speakers, you're welcome to address each individual or have general comments for discussion. Chris?
Well, thank you. Those were three excellent papers, a great start. Luann, I want to return to your paper. I admire your fearless speech, and we need more of it. The Greeks called this parasia, but the Greeks also gave us another term, archaeology. And that should remind us that archaeology is not reducible to capitalism. I mean, capitalism is a mode of functioning. It's a monster that kind of produces its own necessity. And in every conjunction, it actually destroys those who don't participate or don't enter into it and take up these new opportunities. But archaeology is not reducible to that. I would agree with the whole paper if you replaced archaeology with capitalism. But it's a community. It's a whole set of practices and relationships. And that resistance to say it's not reducible to capitalism is actually part of resisting capitalism, which appropriates everything. And to say that a future without archaeology is to allow capitalism to appropriate that and say, well, there you go, when in fact, archaeology is much more than a discipline. So, that's my point.
Peter? I have a sort of similar critique as well. I think you made a lot of very good points, but I think it was very much one-sided. And I'm thinking that it's rather ironic that the paper that followed showed how archaeology does give voice to subaltern peoples, and that however much embedded in a capitalist society archaeology is, archaeology has on many, many occasions challenged and discomfited the capitalist establishment. And a couple of cases that come to mind are the excavation of the Negro burial ground in Manhattan about 20 years ago, or the ongoing excavation of slave quarters at that bastion of capitalism, Colonial Williamsburg. And finally, a final comment. I think if you looked at the Brown University course catalog, you could find courses that are offered today that correspond almost exactly to the laundry list you gave of courses from the IWW. The universities, however much have been co-opted by and embedded in the capitalist system, nevertheless are one of the few places where other voices can be heard, and that goes for archaeology as well.
Yeah, I know you'll have responses, but Uzma, I know you had comments.
Well,
also.
I'll let Luann respond, and then I'd like to kind of take that same conversation elsewhere, actually. So.
Well, I mean, my response is, of course, that I am an archaeologist. I consider myself one, and I think my research raises all those questions. So, I wasn't intentionally saying we don't need archaeology and archaeology is useful, but what I was trying to do is spotlight those structures that we work in and to really think about, well, what kind of difference we make. And it's a lot of what I was talking about are just things that I worry about. I mean, I teach those courses year after year, and the constant student body is even less and less critical with each passing year. So so there's always been that discussion is, oh, we can transform this from in the academy. And I'm not going to stop doing my job and stop trying. But so a lot of that paper wasn't saying that we're all useless and just go do something else, but to really think, are they alternate structures? Are we feeding into the the beast itself in some ways? And so of course, I worry about your comments as well. I really think that the way archaeologists work can shed light on, and the other two papers show that. There's real utility of it. So I wasn't really saying, well, we shouldn't do archaeology, but mainly thinking about those disciplinary structures that guide our labor to think, are there other alternatives where we can make other differences?
Ugo, did you have your hand up back there?
Yeah, but Usman,
Oh, sure. Sorry about that.
So I just wanted to kind of follow up with that because I do think that was clear in your paper actually. Like I think in the earlier probably in the first page or so, it sounded like you were saying throughout archaeology. But I think as you went through the paper, you situated it very clearly. And I do think that universities are being taken over by a neoliberal agenda. I do think that this is actually happening. And I do think capitalism is a system that is perpetuating a certain kind of way of being. But one of the things that I wanted to ask and maybe kind of put out there, because you are in company of individuals who are theory-minded and who are thinking about this and who are thinking about resistance and revolution, right, is it's not actually that difficult to join a free university. This is a very uniquely American problem that we don't have free universities here. In Europe and other parts of the world, I'm teaching at free universities all the time, right? There is a way to actually make that happen. And I would hope that in the United States that we would be able to consider alternative ways of thinking and of teaching that aren't linked to a capitalist system, right? And it's possible, and it's actually incredibly generative. And this is kind of where I thought, it was a great first session because it linked so well to Laura's work, right? So this idea of moving out of, when you talk about public intellectualism, moving out of just archaeology, right? Work with the performance artists. That moment that you're gonna have in that space in the 21st is gonna be amazingly transformative and educational for a lot of people, and it's outside of a certain kind of capitalist system, right? Having said that, Ai Weiwei is playing with capitalism. Those images of the heated blankets and then having celebrities wear those same heated blankets is actually the way in which you critique that same capitalist system that the art market is a part of. So just because we move out of archaeology, we have to continue to be critical and sort of cognizant of how other disciplines are also being co-opted by capitalism. Right? So, and I don't know, there was no question there, but just that I really enjoyed the papers. So, yeah.
yeah, I guess I think you didn't go far enough, Luann. That's fine. And being one of the very few non-white people in the room actually, I think, shows that point. I don't think anything is reducible to capitalism, not even capital. Right? And I think where you don't go far enough is how capitalist we are, right? And how much it is part of our own critique. Capitalism survives because we critique it. If we stopped criticizing it, it would go away, right? It's like the person we love, right? They're actually there because we hate them, right? If we were indifferent to them, they would go away, right? So the real issue, right, is it's not even it's how we're constituted by capitalism. How this is an inherent part of who we are, what we do, and what we see, right? And so it's illusory, right? It's a fantasy to think that we can step out. And that's why I think Weiwei's approach is so provocatively interesting, right? Because he's not trying to step out of that, but actually confront us with that mirror, and that mirror self-reflection is us, right? And I like the other two papers, not because I think they were successful. I think they're very good failures, right? And I think that's what we need, to accept those failures, right? The failures of diversity of this conference, for example. It's important to recognize that, right? And I think that failure is really wonderful, right? Because it also allows us to say, right, we're human. And in certain situations, like the migration crisis right now, we don't have a solution. Maybe silence is necessary sometimes. Right? Maybe we just need to step and say, this is a conundrum. And why should we succeed, right? where a century of our discipline has not. It's also respect to our ancestors in a way, right? And there's a question there somewhere, I'm sure.
Yeah, I need a copy of that paper. I mean, that was like, there's lots in there. And as someone feeling just like I got off the plane from Orlando, which, that paper needed to be presented at Orlando. And what a disaster. That conference was a disaster. And it was a disaster in part because we were in the heart of capitalism, right? But what I was thinking about was speed, right? So you mentioned sort of tenure and the issues that those of us going up for tenure, fingers crossed over here, is the issue that we're on a rat race, right? And the SAAs are a great example of this. And there's that whole slow science movement out there, particularly in Europe. And it strikes me that on the one hand, the kinds of discussions that we heard this morning were about slowing down and contemplating and reflecting. And yet I'm also struck by this last talk, which is all about you cannot slow down. I'm new to this world of archaeology, the contemporary. This stuff's happened quickly, right? We've got to get in there quickly and enact it. And so for me, again, as someone who thinks a lot about temporality, often in the deeper past, it strikes me that we have a temporal tension here, which is the need to slow down as a critique of capitalism, but also the need to keep up to properly be able to do that.
I wanted to also talk about Luann's paper briefly, with which the suggestion that archaeologists have been able to adapt to the neoliberalist capitalism that the university is trying to impose upon them. I find in my own instance that this has not happened for the majority of my colleagues, and they're guilty of operating under the old model and trying to do and teach and publish about archaeology in a way that doesn't suit the present at all. And so Lauren Olivier's talk comes in very well there, because they're not acknowledging the archaeology in and of the present, and they're also structuring the academic program to ensure that no one's going to be participatory in the capitalist system. So they're being strangely subversive, but unwillingly and unwittingly, I think, because they haven't come forward and acknowledged the new model of capitalism that exists.
And and I wonder, I've been thinking a lot about, obviously I've been thinking a lot about these things to write the paper, but, and I've been thinking a lot about how these transformations impact different institutions in different way. My whole experience is with state institutions, both as a graduate student and, the places that I've taught, and I suspect, some of those state institutions are feeling more pressure to conform to those new, those new constraints than maybe other institutions that have different standards of prestige or, what. And I don't mean to imply anything snooty or anything, but that impacts us differently, and so some of us perhaps can ignore those structures in our everyday work life more than others. I guess that's what I'm thinking about, and Krista's nodding, so perhaps you're feeling it too. But it's increasingly becoming, in my experience, is like, well, do we even need archaeology? Anthropology, what does that do? And I wanted to tie in, what was the governor of Florida's, Rick Scott's quote that everybody was, we don't need more anthropologists. And I think, rather than, you don't understand what anthropology is about, I think that's a real objective statement about, the role of anthropology in the new neoliberal world that we need to take seriously rather than, you're just ignorant.
I agree that contract work sometimes is done really just to support a particular developer or capitalist effort. But often you're basically compromised. You want to do the research, and the only way to do the research is to take the devil's money. So sometimes you have to do that, and sometimes you think you're on the side of the angels, and then it switches. You do the work. We just did a big study with Boston Chain Forge for a hotel developer who really seemed intent on leaving almost all of it intact and using all sorts of interpretive devices that we'd suggested. And now I'm not convinced that that report did any more than just check off what he had to do in order to do the hotel. But on the other hand, some of the best examples I could think of are from your university, where one of the few places where environmental studies is closely linked to archaeology. Most places it's not very closely linked, certainly not here. But at Michigan Tech, you take somebody like Fred Quivik. Fred Quivik is a thorn in the side of more capitalist institutions than anybody I can think of, because he's a noted legal expert. What he does is do the archaeology and then go into court as an expert witness. And he's really been certifying the title of expert witness for an archaeologist or an historian. And the work that he's done on Superfund sites, for instance, will transform the future landscape. So I think, your institution actually does a better job than most.
Thank you. And we're running out of time, but I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but after giving Luann's paper, we have a number of graduate students here, so I was wondering if there would be a graduate student. Oh, Alex, thank you so much.
I'm interested in getting back to that comment about kind of the neoliberal position that we don't need more anthropologists. Isn't that kind of an argument to continue producing PhDs? Like, should we be producing more PhDs than we need to fill teaching positions as a way to kind of spread archaeological thought beyond the institution? Like, that could be one of our mechanisms for entering archaeology into the broader public?
That's a great comment and a great question. And of course, my answer is there should be way more anthropologists in every position, in every level of government. But the reality is that's not going to happen, So to be training more, archaeologists, because we would like to see more subversive action, is probably going to lead to a lot of very hungry, disgruntled, people. So I certainly appreciate that. I mean, you can imagine that if there were more, anthropologists in all positions, then maybe we wouldn't be seeing those neoliberal transformations in the same way. But
Cornelius?
I think it was a brilliant talk, what you presented, because see what happened. It got us going and thinking. No, it was very well. I just want to add somebody mentioned the European perspective. And I think one aspect I would like to add to this debate is that I think we need to ask what kind of capitalism. I mean, of course, Europe is also capitalist. It's not that, but it's more regulated. It's controlled in a different way, and it has a lot of problems, of course. But it also creates potential, and that's the point I want to make, because we've just started a research school with external funding, nearly completely. And this comes from a capitalist source. It's a major foundation in Sweden to support the competitiveness of Swedish industry. And we got the research school in archaeology out of that. And it's co-funded from contract archaeology. Now, all this system doesn't work like CRM in this country because of the regulations. And the companies we're working with and this big foundation, what they're aiming at is to increase the market for archaeology in society. And that means all the research projects are about the impact of archaeology in society, a potential impact, how to make a difference. And for example, one of the things we're dealing with is just immigration issues. How can we develop services for society that make use of the skills and potential that the immigrants bring to Sweden right now? And there's just no knowledge about that, and especially not what archaeology or the humanities can do with that. So this is something we're discussing in that context. So here's a development that I think is for the good of society, and maybe in some ways in what you're also hoping to see. But that comes out of the capitalist system. We wouldn't have had this research without the capitalist system, without these funds, without the companies co-funding it. So I think it's more complex, and it does depend on the local circumstances. And there is hope, even in a capitalist system. That doesn't justify it, but it means it needs to be. It's more complex. Maybe.
No, you're absolutely right. And so to play devil's advocate, these are the things I worry about.
Yeah.
So that Exxon money, where did that come from? And the fact that you can do that, how did that impact other people's lives? And so, again, I don't know. And this is where I'm increasingly getting really worried that that we can have happy capitalism, because it's it's occurring on this global scale in the sense that benefits for us. And I'm an archaeologist. I love archaeology. I don't want to stop doing what I do, but I worry that my ability to do this has real implications on the ability of other people to live the kind of life that I think they should. And that's that's what I worry about. And I've been thinking a lot about the European model. I mean, I've been working on starting a project on Finnish immigration in northern Michigan, and I'm really interested in labor radicalism. What is it about the Finnish experience that made them some of the most radical labor in American history? And so thinking about Finnish radical labor education is sort of where this paper came from. And you look at globally the Finnish Finnish education model. I mean, it's world renowned as one of the best models for neoliberal education. And so there's all kinds of I would rather have a world with those kind of models that are not the neoliberal capitalism the way we know it in the States, but that I don't think we should fool ourselves that that's the best of all possible worlds. How about that?
I know this conversation could go on for the
I know,
rest
it
of the day
does.
if you wanted to. But for now, we're going to have 15 minutes of break, and we're going to reconvene at 11 for our next session. So please, one more time, help me in thanking our first speakers. Thank you very much.